No one saw it coming. One moment, it was a heated debate. The next, a career-ending controversy, live on air. It all started as just another morning in the world of political television. Karoline Leavitt, a bold and rising conservative voice, had been invited onto the Morning Current, a show known for its no-holds-barred debates. Sitting across from her was Martin Holloway, a veteran journalist who had spent years building his reputation as a relentless interviewer. His style was aggressive, his questions sharp, and he had a habit of pushing his guests to their limits. Karoline knew exactly what she was walking into. She had faced tough interviews before, and she wasn't one to back down. But this time was different. This wasn't a calm, pre-recorded discussion where producers could step in and smooth things over. This was live television, raw, unpredictable, and happening in real time. Whatever was said in that moment would be out in the world forever, with no chance to edit, no opportunity to take anything back. At first, it was just another heated exchange. Martin pressed Karoline on media bias, insisting that conservative outlets spread misinformation, while networks like his simply corrected the record. Karoline pushed back with facts, pointing out times when mainstream media had twisted narratives or left out key details. The tension in the studio was thick, but the debate was still within normal bounds. Then, something shifted. Martin's tone hardened, his expression tightened, and suddenly, the debate turned into something else entirely. The words that left his mouth next would change everything, not just for him, but for the entire network he represented. What happened in the next few minutes would go down as one of the most shocking moments in live television history. Martin Holloway leaned forward, his eyes locked on Karoline Leavitt as he launched into his first question. His tone was sharp, his words deliberate. Let's be honest, Karoline. Conservative media thrives on misinformation. You push this idea that mainstream news is biased, but isn't it really just an excuse to spread false narratives? His voice carried the confidence of someone who had asked this question 100 times before, expecting the same weak, rehearsed response. But Karoline didn't flinch. She met his gaze, calm and composed. "That's an interesting claim, Martin," she said, her voice steady. "But let's look at the facts. There have been multiple instances where mainstream networks have misrepresented stories, omitted key details, or outright misled the public. Do you really believe that bias only exists on one side?" Martin smirked, shaking his head slightly. "So now you're saying the real victims here are conservatives? Come on, Karoline. Let's not pretend like your side hasn't been caught twisting the truth." His words carried an edge, a challenge he was daring her to take. Karoline didn't hesitate. "I'm not pretending anything. I'm simply pointing out that when the media decides which stories to highlight and which ones to bury, that's not just journalism. It's control. And when conservatives call it out, we're labeled as conspiracy theorists, instead of people demanding accountability." The tension in the studio was growing. The usual back and forth of political debates had taken on a different energy. Martin's smile had faded. His posture stiffened. He wasn't just challenging Karoline anymore. He was irritated. "People like you," he said, his voice tightening, "are the reason this country is backsliding." The room went silent. Even the crew, who had seen countless heated debates unfold on this very set, seemed to pause. Karoline blinked, her expression unreadable. She let the weight of his words settle in the air before responding. "Excuse me?" Martin shifted in his seat, realizing, perhaps too late, that he had crossed a line. But instead of stepping back, he doubled down. "You push this fake narrative of victimhood, acting like conservatives are being silenced, when in reality, you're the ones shutting down opposing voices." The silence deepened. Karoline didn't interrupt. She didn't raise her voice. She simply let the moment hang there, waiting for him to realize what he had just done. And in that moment, everything changed. The weight of Martin's words seemed to press down on the room. The usual hum of quiet movement behind the cameras had stilled. Even the producers, who had seen their fair share of fiery exchanges, suddenly looked uneasy. For a moment, it was as if time itself had frozen. Karoline sat still, her expression composed but sharp, eyes locked on the man across from her. "Excuse me?" Her voice wasn't raised, but the power behind it was undeniable. She wasn't reacting in anger. She wasn't rattled. She was simply giving him a chance to clarify, to realize what he had just said. But Martin didn't take the chance. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head, as if he was the one growing frustrated. "You heard me," he said, his tone clipped. "Your people push this fake victimhood narrative, when in reality, you're the one silencing others." The silence that followed was suffocating. The words had left his mouth, and there was no taking them back. Your people. Two words that carried weight far beyond the conversation at hand. Two words that could be dissected, replayed, twisted, and analyzed 1,000 times over. Karoline's posture didn't change, but something in her eyes did. She leaned forward slightly, her voice calm, measured. "Would you like to clarify what you mean by your people?" For the first time, Martin hesitated. It was brief, just a flicker of uncertainty, but it was there. And in the fast-moving world of live television, a second of hesitation was all it took. The energy in the studio had shifted entirely. Crew members exchanged glances. Producers behind the glass stiffened. They knew what Karoline knew. This moment would not be forgotten. Martin let out a short, forced laugh. "Oh, come on, Karoline. Don't play this game," he said, but there was something different in his voice now. Less control, more desperation. "You know exactly what I meant. Conservatives like you act like free speech is under attack, but what you really want is control." Karoline didn't flinch. "So, just to be clear," she said, tilting her head slightly, "when you said your people, you weren't referring to anything beyond political ideology?" Martin's jaw tightened. He had been in this game long enough to recognize the trap he had walked into. If he pushed back too hard, he would confirm what people were already beginning to think. If he admitted it was a poor choice of words, he would look weak. His only option, in his mind, was to redirect. He leaned back, exhaling in frustration. "This is exactly what I'm talking about. Bad faith outrage. Instead of engaging with the actual argument, you'd rather twist my words and make it about yourself." Karoline didn't respond right away. She let his words settle, let the audience absorb them, let the weight of the moment deepen. Then, finally, she said, "I don't need to twist anything, Martin. Your words speak for themselves." For the first time in his career, Martin Holloway had lost control of the conversation, and in that instant, his fate was sealed. The moment the broadcast ended, the storm began. It started with a single clip, a short, 15-second snippet of Martin Holloway's words, stripped of context but powerful enough to spread like wildfire. "Your people push this fake victimhood narrative." That was all it took. Within minutes, social media was flooded with reactions. Some were in shock, others were furious, and many were demanding action. The hashtag started trending almost immediately. Hashtag Fire Martin Holloway, hashtag Media Bias Exposed, hashtag Karoline Was Right. Each one gaining traction faster than the network could react. At first, it was just political commentators and media analysts dissecting the exchange, breaking down every word, every pause, every flicker of hesitation in Martin's face. But soon, it spread far beyond the usual circles. Influencers, celebrities, and everyday viewers all had something to say. Some called it a revealing moment, proof of the deep-rooted bias in mainstream media. Others framed it as yet another example of public outrage spiraling out of control. Either way, one thing was clear. People were watching, and they weren't looking away. News outlets picked up the story almost instantly. Right-leaning platforms ran headlines like, "Karoline Leavitt shuts down liberal host on live TV," and "Media bias exposed in one sentence." Left-leaning outlets scrambled to control the narrative, some calling it a misunderstood exchange, while others avoided the topic altogether, hoping the outrage would fade. But it didn't. By midday, the network executives were in full-blown crisis mode. The emails poured in, viewers threatening to boycott the show, demanding a response. But what really sent them into panic was the reaction from advertisers. The first major sponsor quietly pulled their ads from the Morning Current, releasing a carefully worded statement about reviewing their partnership with the network. Then came another, and another. Within hours, 5 major brands had suspended their sponsorships. Martin Holloway, for the first time in his long career, was silent. No tweets, no statements, nothing. His usual confidence had vanished, replaced by a deafening quiet. It was clear he was waiting to see how bad this would get before deciding his next move. But the problem was, it was already too late. Meanwhile, Karoline Leavitt didn't need to say a word. She simply retweeted the viral clip with nothing but a thinking face emoji. That alone was enough to send her supporters into overdrive. While some called her out for playing into the outrage, others praised her for staying composed while the internet did the work for her. Inside the network's headquarters, executives debated their options. They had seen backlash before, but this was different. It wasn't just about one bad moment. It was about the message it sent. Defending Martin could mean alienating a massive portion of their audience, but cutting ties with him would set a precedent they weren't sure they wanted to set. Either way, the pressure was mounting, and they were running out of time. As the evening approached, more sponsors distanced themselves from the show, and internal discussions turned into emergency meetings. The network had a choice to make: stand by their longtime host and hope the outrage passed, or cut him loose before the damage became irreversible. But the internet had already made its decision, and Martin Holloway was at the center of a controversy that was only getting bigger by the hour. Inside the headquarters of NBS News, the mood was tense. The executives had seen media firestorms before, but nothing like this. The outrage wasn't dying down. It was growing. Every passing hour brought new headlines, more backlash, and another wave of furious comments flooding their inboxes. The viral clip had now been viewed millions of times, and the hashtags demanding Martin Holloway's firing refused to disappear. An emergency meeting was called. The room was packed with top executives, PR specialists, and legal advisors, all scrambling to find a way out of this mess. The options were clear, but neither was good. They could defend Martin, insist that his words were being misinterpreted, and hope the outrage burned out. But that meant risking the network's reputation and losing even more advertisers. Or they could cut ties with him and try to contain the damage. But firing a veteran journalist over one exchange could open up an entirely different controversy. Maybe we ride this out, one executive suggested. These things fade. We release a statement clarifying his comments, give it a few days, and move on. But even as the words left his mouth, he didn't sound convinced. That might have worked 10 years ago, another snapped. But this isn't 10 years ago. This is the internet. This is millions of people dissecting every second of that clip. And it's not going away. The room fell silent. No one disagreed. The reality was clear. The damage was already spiraling beyond their control. And to make matters worse, advertisers weren't just suspending sponsorships anymore. They were pulling out entirely. Every hour that passed without a decision was costing them money, credibility, and audience trust. Finally, after hours of debate, they made a choice. At 3 p.m., NBS News released an official statement. Martin Holloway has been placed on indefinite suspension while we conduct an internal review of yesterday's broadcast. NBS News remains committed to respectful and fair journalism. It was the safest move they could make, a half measure designed to buy them time. But it didn't work. If anything, it made things worse. The internet exploded again, but this time, it wasn't just conservatives calling for Martin's firing. It was everyone. The suspension felt like a weak attempt to calm the outrage without taking real action. The backlash only intensified, and the sponsors who had stayed quiet so far began pulling out one by one. Meanwhile, Karoline Leavitt remained completely silent. No statements, no interviews, no attempts to fuel the controversy. She didn't need to. The internet was already doing the work for her. Every political commentator, news outlet, and influencer had something to say about the situation, and the pressure on NBS News continued to mount. By the next morning, it was clear that the suspension wasn't enough. The executives met again, this time with a much harsher reality in front of them. They had a choice to make, and they were running out of time. The network had always prided itself on standing by its anchors, but Martin Holloway was no longer just a host. He was a liability. Viewers were leaving. Advertisers were disappearing. And the controversy wasn't showing any signs of slowing down. Finally, after one last round of tense discussions, the decision was made. Martin Holloway had to go. The next morning, the executives at NBS News made their final decision. The debate was over, the numbers were in, and the damage was undeniable. The suspension had done nothing to slow the backlash. If anything, it had made things worse. More advertisers had pulled out overnight, and public trust in the network was plummeting. Every news outlet was talking about it. Every political commentator had an opinion, and every social media platform was flooded with arguments. At exactly 9:15 a.m., the network released its final statement. Effective immediately, Martin Holloway is no longer affiliated with NBS News. We thank him for his years of service and wish him the best in his future endeavors. It was short, cold, and designed to be the end of the story, but it wasn't. The reaction was immediate. Some celebrated, calling it a long overdue moment of accountability. To them, this wasn't just about Martin Holloway. It was about years of unchecked media bias, arrogance, and condescension toward half the country. His words, they argued, had exposed the exact problem people had been pointing out for years. His firing was proof that media figures weren't untouchable anymore, that they couldn't talk down to millions of viewers and expect no consequences. But others saw it differently. To them, this was cancel culture at its worst. A veteran journalist, fired over a single exchange, over one moment that had been blown out of proportion. They pointed out that media was built on debate, on heated conversations, and if a host could be fired this easily, what did that mean for the future? Was this really about accountability, or was it about silencing voices that didn't fit the right narrative? Political commentators wasted no time jumping on the story. Conservative outlets ran with headlines like, "Mainstream media finally exposed," and "Karoline Leavitt just took down a liberal TV host on live TV." They painted Martin Holloway's firing as a victory, a turning point in the fight against media bias. On the other side, left-leaning networks tried to distance themselves from the controversy, some even avoiding the topic altogether, hoping it would fade. But Martin Holloway wasn't ready to disappear. Later that evening, he broke his silence. Instead of a press conference or a carefully worded apology, he posted a video on social media. Sitting in a dimly lit room, he looked exhausted but defiant. "I was fired because I spoke the truth," he said, his voice low but firm. "The media doesn't want truth. They want compliance. If you step out of line, if you challenge the narrative, you're gone. This isn't just about me. This is about all of us." The video exploded. Within hours, it had millions of views. His supporters rallied behind him, calling for boycotts of NBS News, attacking the advertisers who had pulled out, and demanding that Martin start his own independent platform. His critics pushed back, arguing that this wasn't some grand conspiracy. He had simply crossed a line, and he had faced the consequences. And through it all, Karoline Leavitt remained silent. She didn't gloat, didn't engage in the drama, didn't try to take credit. She simply moved on, letting the world argue for her. But this wasn't just about Martin Holloway anymore. This was about the future of media itself. Was this a long overdue moment of accountability, or had the internet become judge, jury, and executioner? Were public figures finally being held responsible for their words, or were they now at the mercy of viral outrage? The dust was settling, but the debate wasn't going anywhere. And as the conversation raged on, one thing was certain: this would not be the last time a moment like this happened. The fallout from Martin Holloway's firing didn't end with the network's statement. If anything, it only deepened the divide. The media world had split in two, and there was no middle ground. On one side, people saw this as a long overdue reckoning, a clear message that media figures were no longer untouchable. To them, Martin's words weren't just a slip of the tongue. They were revealing. His dismissal wasn't about one bad moment. It was about years of arrogance from mainstream journalists who thought they could talk down to millions of Americans without consequences. His firing, they argued, was proof that times were changing. On the other side, the outrage took a different form. They called it a dangerous precedent, a sign that cancel culture had gone too far. A man had lost his job over a single comment, over a debate that had gotten too heated. If someone as established as Martin Holloway could be erased overnight, what did that mean for everyone else? Was this really about accountability, or was it about silencing opinions that didn't fit the narrative? They warned that today it was Martin, but tomorrow it could be anyone. As the debate raged on, Martin himself wasn't done. His first video had already racked up millions of views, and his supporters were rallying around him. He continued to speak out, framing himself as a victim of a system that punished those who spoke the truth. "They don't want discussion. They don't want debate. They want control," he said in one of his follow-up videos. "I won't be silenced." His audience only grew, with thousands urging him to start his own platform, to break free from corporate media and speak without restriction. Meanwhile, Karoline Leavitt did exactly what she had done from the beginning. Nothing. No victory laps, no interviews taking credit, no statements fueling the controversy. She didn't need to. The world was already talking for her. Some called her strategic, saying she had played the moment perfectly, letting the network destroy itself while she remained composed. Others called her lucky, arguing that Martin's mistake had done all the work for her. Either way, she had cemented herself as more than just another conservative voice. She had become the woman who had stood her ground while a media giant crumbled in front of her. But beyond Martin and Karoline, the bigger question remained. What did this moment really mean? Was it justice or censorship? A necessary consequence or a dangerous overreaction? In the days that followed, think pieces flooded every major outlet, panel discussions dissected every angle, and the debate refused to die. Some saw it as a victory for accountability. Others feared it was proof that viral outrage now dictated reality. One thing was clear. This wasn't just about Martin Holloway anymore. This was about the future of public discourse, the power of social media, and the fine line between accountability and suppression. And as the dust settled, the only real question left was, who would be next? And just like that, Martin Holloway was gone. His career at NBC News had ended in a matter of days, not because of years of journalism, not because of a scandal off camera, but because of a single moment, two words that couldn't be taken back. His supporters called it proof that the media world was broken, that anyone who dared to challenge the wrong people could be erased overnight. His critics saw it as long overdue accountability, a sign that media figures could no longer speak recklessly and expect no consequences. But beyond Martin and Karoline, this moment had sparked a much bigger conversation. It wasn't just about one man's words or one woman's response. It was about power, who controls the narrative, who decides what is acceptable, and what happens when public outrage takes on a life of its own. Social media had turned a heated debate into a national controversy, and in the end, it wasn't the network that decided Martin's fate. It was the people watching. So now, the question is yours to answer. Was this justice or cancel culture? Did Karoline expose media bias, or did the internet decide someone's fate too quickly? Was this a necessary consequence or a dangerous overreaction? Let us know what you think in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that challenge the way we see the world.